Hi there.
Hey
Hey.
guys.
And I have to say, thanks to the magic of technology, you don't just have to hear us, you can see us too. We're streaming live at facebook.com/KUOW Public Radio and on YouTube at youtube.com/user/KUOW 949. So it is Friday. And so to mark this occasion, as we do on every Friday, we are going to talk about coronavirus news. Case numbers continue to rise in Washington state, particularly among young adults. And in response to those rising numbers, Governor Inslee has called for an indefinite pause on reopening the state. New restrictions on the current phases also go into effect this week, particularly for restaurants. Chase, what are those new restrictions?
Yeah, so the new restrictions for restaurants is one thing that I think is really interesting is that indoor dining is going to be restricted to, it has to be within your own household. So a host or a hostess is going to sort of have to ask people, hey, do you guys live in the same household? And people are going to have to be honest about that and say if they do or they do not. Otherwise, they'll have to sort of eat outdoors. So if you're having a not a TikTok date, we were just talking about TikTok. If you're having a Tinder date, then you'll have to go to the patio. There's also restrictions on on bar service, but the indoor dining restriction I think is one of the newest ones, and no booze after 10 p.m. as well.
Okay, you talked about people being honest about who they're eating with. Yes, I live with these people. We all live in the same household. How do you enforce a restriction like you can only eat with members of the same household? Karen, what do you think?
Oh man, I mean, a lot of the COVID protections essentially require a bit of trust in humanity and faith, and I think we've seen mixed responses to that. And it also pushes a lot of enforcement pressures on low-wage workers at grocery stores or the hosts at a restaurant, which is not a lucrative job. So I feel for people who have to try to enforce it. If you suspect, really, are you all really the same household? And I don't know. I don't have a great answer for that. I think there's a lot of we trust you, and that's a hard way to enforce things. I just don't get, as a side note, why would you go out to dinner then? I don't know. I just feel like the risk reward, if it's just with your family, I would just do takeout. I don't know, or like your roommates or something. I understand getting a place to go meet with other people. But if you can't do that, then I don't know. I'm curious if other people have a strong desire to go inside. Get me out of any indoor space is my personal approach.
That's a fair question. I mean, Jennifer, how are you thinking about the risk reward ratio as it pertains to your involvement with this phased reopening?
Yeah, I try to look at it from, the livelihood of these business owners, these restaurant owners. And I think it's been like a balancing act with government officials trying to keep public health in mind while also not totally shutting the door on these businesses again. So I think it's a difficult balance to meet. And really it is up to your own personal choice. Do you feel comfortable dining in an enclosed space? And starting today, you can't do that unless you live with the person. And it's all based on honor systems. So can we really enforce it? Are we going to see battles happening at restaurants where people are going to be accusing others of, hey, you guys don't live with each other? Kind of like what we saw with mask wearing. I wonder.
Yeah. I'm wondering whether restaurants can survive a full-on shutdown of indoor dining, though. Chase, what do you think about that?
Yeah, I mean, we've spoken to a lot of restaurants and bars, and they've told us that if they have to do another rollback, then they're not going to be able to survive. And so one of the things that I've heard a lot from restaurants is they really want to rapidly explore other options like street dining, not just sidewalk dining, but can they expand into the street? And the city's been working with them, and there's been some good responses there, but it's still, that involves a lot of permitting. We're reaching the end of the summer, and I feel like what's happening here is we don't really have a plan for restaurants if we have to do a full rollback with indoor dining. And so we're sort of like straddling both sides here. But it just seems to me like it's sort of inevitable. I mean, that indoor dining thing with the same household just really struck me as a little confusing. I thought that we were going to get a rollback, but this just seems like it's sort of like a half measure, and I expect a sort of more intense measure in the future.
Well, I spoke with King County Executive Dow Constantine earlier this week, and he said that the rise we're seeing in cases isn't really because of the phased reopening.
I think that a lot of the issue is not the activities that have been formally allowed after the initial lockdown order. A lot of it is people taking that as a signal that they can let down their guard. I think it's pretty well accepted that informal gatherings, people not being as careful as they were originally, is what's causing the upsurge in infections. And even the dining inside restaurants, while that may be among the more dangerous of the things that has been allowed, in the sense that you've got a lot of people in an enclosed space, I don't think that compares to people having informal gatherings, parties, etc., particularly inside. That's where we think we are seeing a lot of the infections take place.
Does Dow Constantine have a point here? If we were better at not gathering informally, would we be able to take reopening?
I think limiting the number of people you are interacting with will obviously limit the exposure of this disease, because I think from the beginning, we've heard that, person-to-person interaction, the way this virus thrives. And to his point, and, other people we've heard from, those backyard barbecues, those hangouts, that's something where really like government has no business saying you can't, they really can't put restrictions down other than to say limit. But how do you enforce that? Kind of going back to Chase's point.
Right. Well, Jennifer, one of the things you've been looking into recently is contact tracing. What does the process look like for investigating where coronavirus cases are coming from right now?
Yeah, this was a really interesting story for us to go into and just kind of see from, the health department's point of view. We went down to Pierce County, Tacoma Pierce County Health Department. And I think this is the easiest way that I understood it. So let's say you go and get tested. If you test positive, your name and number is passed on to a case investigator. Then that case investigator will start looking into the case, the COVID-19 case, make that initial phone call. Hopefully the person answers, asks questions about, where have you been? When do you think you were exposed? Have you been in close contact with other people? And that's where the contact tracer, a separate investigator, will take that information and start making phone calls. And they say they will never, ever give out information about who you may have been exposed by, but you will be given a date of exposure.
Okay. I want to talk about one particular aspect of this process. Contact tracers calling and hopefully someone answers. I don't answer my phone. I mean, Karen, would you?
I will say, as a journalist who cold calls people all the time, I feel like spam has like ruined journalism because people don't pick up random numbers anymore. They used to all the time. You picked up your phone when it rang, and it's definitely like my hit rate has plummeted. And so I feel for the contact tracers, and it's obvious, same as we hear with polling and, electoral polling and stuff like that. It's a problem.
Right. That's a really good point. Chase, do you answer your phone? Would you answer your phone if you didn't recognize the number?
I sort of use my voicemail as like a personal receptionist, and then I'm just like, I'll let that sort of screen it. But I do think I do respond to text pretty quickly. And so I know there are ways that you can sort of text people very quickly. So I feel like maybe text is a good idea. It might get more responses.
Okay, well, if anyone who is in charge of the contact tracing program, if you're listening to this, maybe try texting people rather than calling them. That might be helpful. Let's pivot a little and talk about the economy, which made a kind of history this week. Our gross domestic product dropped 32.9% in the last quarter. This is the biggest quarterly drop ever recorded. Here's economist Diane Swank on Marketplace.
What's important is the losses were so broad-based. We saw them in every single category, even in government spending, where increases at the federal level offset declines at the state and local level, which were quite steep. And in fact, if we do not see major transfers of funds to state and local governments, the cuts in employment that we saw during the quarter will only compound as we get into the summer.
And we also know that weekly $600 CARES Act assistance checks are about to stop. Those checks actually helped lower the overall rate of poverty in Washington state. So we could be facing a worse statewide economic outlook than we have in months. I talked with Seattle Mayor Jenny Durkan about that yesterday.
The projections aren't good. And I hate to say that, but in best case scenario, we won't have a vaccine until sometime next year. And that means for the next 6 months, we're going to have to be phasing in and out of these kinds of restrictions, which is so hard on workers, on small businesses, on people being separated from one another. So we're in this for a very long marathon.
Jennifer, you've been working on a story about unemployment. What are you seeing there?
It's really sad to hear the circumstances people are finding themselves in when it comes to, jobless claims. We know that there are thousands filed within Washington state and, more than 1 million Americans nationally. So just to hear, someone who never has been in this position, always was able to pay their bills, then all of a sudden, once that first wave of restrictions came in March, being in total shock, then having to pick themselves back up, file for unemployment, then not hear back for weeks and meaning like months. I think people are in a really tough spot and it's going to continue.
Jace, what do you think we're looking at over the next year here? What should we be expecting?
In the Seattle area, I think that we're probably going to see the inequality really increase. We know that, some people are fairly protected by this pandemic and that, a lot of tech jobs are safe. A lot of tech companies are doing fairly well. Also, obviously, a lot of tech jobs can work from home. And so I think in those cases, you're going to see a lot of people that weather this, at least economically, fairly well. But then you're also going to see people in the service industry and people in retail really be hit hard. And I think that we're going to see the same story we've been seeing, but accelerated. I think that happens a lot with coronavirus is the trends just sort of accelerate. And so what I'm worried about is that gap just becoming greater.
Karen, you've been reporting on the big tech companies and how the economy is affecting them. It appears it hasn't really affected them at all.
And doing pretty well in general. Amazon had its record quarter. It was unbelievable levels of 40% growth in revenue, double its profit over the past year. It's record profit, record revenue. But then that doesn't really affect the restaurant owner in South Lake Union. And that is the challenge. So it might affect people, the ability to have more people work as a driver for Amazon or as a picker in a warehouse, something like that. Might see a shift in some jobs for the equivalent of that. But no, you definitely are seeing kind of the high, and obviously the work from home, the tech workers in Seattle can do that. And it's not like people have stopped spending, but we have seen data that shows that wealthier people in general nationally have cut back on spending a lot. And so of the random stuff, because they're not going on vacation, they're not eating out as much. And that's such a huge fuel for the service economy. And a lot of the Seattle region's economy is built on service on top of these huge kind of corporate jobs, corporate empires, essentially. So you'll see some benefits, but I think you'll obviously see a lot of pullback exactly along these kind of unequal lines. And I know Amazon has spent a lot of money trying to build up the South Lake Union area. I know they're concerned about having those restaurants survive on the back end of this. But it's a huge question, I think, regionally about this. And obviously Boeing is facing a lot of trouble. It already done some layoffs, has signaled there'll be more to come. Nordstrom. So the region's big employers are not immune.
I wonder if we're looking, I remember at the end of the Great Recession, we sort of learned that Chase was like the mortgage winner at the end of everything. They were able to sort of buy up all of these mortgages. And I wonder if we're looking at a similar situation with employment at the, whatever the other side of this is, we're going to see a few big companies, probably tech, that are the employers for many more people in our region, which doesn't sound like a wonderful way to sort of have a diverse economy. Karen, what do you think about that?
Yeah, no, I think it's definitely possible. You know, you always don't want to have over concentration in any one industry in the economy. And actually, Seattle, as much tech job as there is, there are other, you know, Boeing is a huge regional employer, Weyerhaeuser. It's not like it's, you know, just tech, but what you don't want is everything else to collapse, essentially. And for everyone's sake, having a diversity in the regional economy is a good thing. And that's, I think having that has helped Seattle through the previous downturns. You know, the Great Recession did not hit Seattle as hard as many other areas, right. In part because it had this exposure to tech, which at the time was growing. Yeah. But yes, you definitely, I think, I mean, Amazon now has about 1 million people employed either directly or as a temporary basis, many of which they say they're going to hire full time. So I think that numbers, that's globally, but the vast majority of that's in the US.
I mean, we also know that another sort of local employer is the Seattle Mariners, right? Our franchise of Major League Baseball, which is happening this year.
Welcome.
Oh, remember this? This is what they were saying at the beginning of the month. They were ramping up for the baseball season, and then things changed. And by this week, it sounded a little more like this.
The pandemic had already shortened the baseball season, and now less than a week into it, there are big problems with the coronavirus.
Major League Baseball announced it is postponing 3 games. Tonight's home opener for the Miami Marlins, a home game for the Philadelphia Phillies, and another Marlins game tomorrow.
Okay. Chase, baseball was just getting started for the year. What happened?
Well, what happened is that a lot of people got coronavirus really quickly. And one of the things that I think happened with baseball that may not happen with other sports is that baseball really attempted to hold a lot of games in a lot of states. So I think they were attempting like a 60-game season across 30 stadiums. And we know that traveling increases spread. And I think it's been like daily. We've seen new COVID cases pop up. Because it's just been a week, right? Like tonight is the home opening, and Governor Inslee is expected to throw the first pitch. I heard there's going to be a video beforehand of like healthcare workers safely handing off the ball to each other and then handing it to Inslee virtually, and then he pitches it to sort of encourage people to stay home and stay healthy. But the move is just going to be a little weird because baseball is not staying home and it's not staying healthy. And so I just think I'm a little worried we might have to cancel more games, but also cancel this season.
Yeah. Jennifer, what do you think about this? Should baseball keep trying or should they just call it?
If they keep trying, which seems like they are, try as they may, they really need to change the way they're doing it. They are such role models for so many of their fans of all ages and families. And I just think that, you know, right off the bat, it just was not good.
Yeah. Well, let's look towards next week. We have a primary election coming up on Tuesday. Voter numbers are low so far. I mean, there's a lot to be distracted by. Maybe people are watching too much baseball. Maybe they're just distracted by everything else that's happening right now. But whatever the reason, it can't be that our voting process is too complicated. There are how-to videos for what seems like every county in Washington state.
In King County, all voting is done by mail. So if you're registered to vote, about 3 weeks before the next election, you'll receive a voter's pamphlet in the mail. It covers all the candidate races.
Oh, and there are also inspirational videos about why we should vote.
There are signs all around us reminding us to vote, even when we are always on the go. One meeting to the next. And even when we try to escape it all. It's time we paid attention and became Pierce County voters.
Do you remember those heady days when we were always on the go? That was something. Okay. So, Chase, why is the voter turnout down?
You know, I'm not entirely sure. What I guess is that there's just a lot to pay attention to. And I think that a lot of the traditional things that would encourage people to vote in a primary haven't happened. A lot of campaigns have to be digital, and a lot of these races are not, really flashy races. I don't know if a lot of people have spent a lot of time thinking about the lieutenant governor's race, even though in the lieutenant governor's race is really important. And so I think people are mostly distracted. What I'm hoping is that we usually see a huge sort of turnout in this last weekend, and sort of people going like, oh, I'm supposed to do that. So I'm hoping that, hearing us talk about this on KUOW may help increase turnout. But there really are not many excuses in our region, and we are a role model, and a lot of places are looking at us. And so I think if we have a lower turnout, it'll be a little bit of an embarrassment, but it'll also maybe be used to sort of signal wrongly that sort of mail-in voting somehow reduces turnout. So I worry a little bit about that.
Do we have any sense of what the polls are saying thus far about what the results of the primary election might be? Even though we all acknowledge nobody answers their phones when pollsters call anymore.
I do know that we don't have a clear Republican candidate challenger to Jay Inslee, and I think that that's one of the races that we're really looking at. Are we going for Republicans? Are they going to have Tim Eyman face off against Jay Inslee? Are they going to have Lauren Culp face off against Jay Inslee? And I think that what's really important about these primary races is they determine the sort of sense of the conversation that we have going into the general. And we know that there's going to be a lot of attention on the general. And so I just think that you should really go out and participate in what that conversation is going to be.
We know that there aren't a lot of Republicans holding higher office in Washington state. Jennifer, do you think that regardless of who the Republican candidate for governor is, they have much of a chance of winning against Jay Inslee, assuming he is our Democratic candidate?
Yeah, I mean, he is the incumbent, and just historically, I think incumbents kind of have the, if you want to call it, upper hand. And I do think that, Jay Inslee has gotten further exposure with this pandemic. He's having those regular pandemic broadcasts that, anyone can tune into. The opinions are obviously on both sides and very strong. So, I guess we'll end up seeing later on in the general election in November. And just going back to Chase's point, I hope that people who are listening and watching will do their part, because it's really important to not only talk the talk, but walk the walk. And I do think mail-in ballots have also historically shown higher percentages of voter turnout. So hopefully that will prove to be the case again in 2020.
One of the things that I've been wondering about for this election is actual election night parties. That does not seem like something that can happen as we're used to it at this moment. Chase, you've been looking at this. What's happening with that?
Yeah, so at The Stranger, we cover the election night parties a lot, and we sort of do this big blog post, and we sort of go out and we sort of go to all these parties. Obviously, that's not happening this year. We've sent inquiries to most of the campaigns, and I think we've gotten like 3 responses back. We know that the Republicans are largely, like, Lauren Culp is throwing an in-person party in Leavenworth as of now, with the live music and food. So that's one thing. But then we've heard from other candidates who are having like a Facebook Live party, and they're sort of encouraging people to like wear a certain color and like drink a certain drink, and they're still trying to facilitate that experience. I think a lot of people can go like, who cares? It's just a party. This is a pandemic. Like, why is this important? But one of the things I think is really important about primary night election parties is there's always like a little turn that you don't expect. And for candidates who suddenly break through into the general, that moment where the media sort of comes around them, takes pictures, you see like, oh, they're surrounded by the people who voted for them and support them. That moment is really important for that campaign. And what I worry about is if we just sort of let this slide by without that attention, then we're not going to have the same sort of energy going into the general.
Well,
if I could,
go ahead, Karen.
It's a little, I think we'll talk about this more later, but this week there were these hearings in Congress with the big tech about antitrust, and they were all done via WebEx. old school. The congressional investigators sort of lost their tobacco moment, tobacco CEO moment, where all the tobacco CEOs were lined up with their hands up, swearing to testify and tell the truth. And so you instead had this screenshot, but they weren't even all in the same row. So like it wasn't even like a line of them. And there's no doubt that there is like a visual or a powerful thing about the kind of presence in a singular space, the way that a election night party, you have this photo, you know, I think everyone remembers the photos of AOC when she found out, she was like, ah, you know, like that. There are things that become iconic visuals or that help focus things on a moment that is just not the same in a Zoom view.
Huh. I hadn't thought about that, but that's, you know, particularly as we're looking towards November, just imagining what the visuals out of that election will look like. We have to take a short break here, but we will be back in just a moment with Chase Burns, Jennifer Lee, and Karen Weise. This is The Week in Review, and I'm Jeannie Yandel.
Welcome back. Yeah, man, how you doing? You good? You like that? I know you like that. How long you been back? And when the beats drop, I know they gon' lean. World debut.
And we will welcome back Week in Review in a moment here. 94.9 KUOW, Seattle's NPR news station. Sound stories, sound voices. It is 73 degrees in Seattle. We're expecting sun this afternoon, high of 80.
Support for KUOW comes from Bill and Paula Clapp, who salute the 160 members of Global Washington who are addressing the COVID crisis in the developing world. Learn more about how to help at globalwa.org.
It's 12:34, and we return to KUOW's Week in Review.
This is The Week in Review from KUOW. I'm Jeannie Yandel. I'm here with Karen Weise, the technology correspondent for the New York Times, Chase Burns, the digital editor for The Stranger, and Jennifer Lee, reporter for Q13. So last weekend, we saw more protests here in Seattle, particularly on Saturday, in support of ongoing protests in Portland and the presence of federal agents there taking people off the streets. Seattle police say protesters tried to light a fire in the lobby of the East Precinct. Protesters were arrested. Police were injured. Legal observers of the protests say they were targeted by the police too. Chase, you said that last weekend's protests felt like things turned back to early June. How so?
Yeah, it definitely did feel that way. And we've been covering the protests right in Capitol Hill near 11th and Pine since they started. And I think one of the reasons it felt like that is because it was centered back near the East Precinct again. Another one of the reasons is because the police, when they declared a riot, were also using a type of force that we hadn't seen in a while. I do want to say, when it feels like we've gone back in time, you know, Portland gets a lot of attention for them having 60 plus days of ongoing protests. I think we sort of think of Portland like that, and we think of Seattle like we just think of Chaz. But the reality is we've been having protests here pretty much every single day since the beginning as well. It's been ongoing. They've been smaller. But the thing that felt like it went back in time was that use of force that we saw on Saturday.
Jennifer, as Chase just pointed out, you know, there have been ongoing protests in Portland, ongoing protests here in Seattle. And one of the patterns that we have seen in both of those places is when police use crowd control weapons like flashbangs or sponge tip rounds, it doesn't actually control the crowd. It escalates things instead. So why do you think police are continuing to use these tools if they are not getting the results the police say they want, which is to help control an unruly crowd?
Mm-hmm. I think based on, you know, just the statements and conversations we've been hearing from the law enforcement side, they're trying to minimize as much damage and injury as possible on both ends. Obviously, things got really heated and escalated. It was declared a riot. There were injuries and arrests and injuries on both sides. So I think that it's really difficult to think about, you know, okay, crowd control tools based on, you know, just evidence and research, you know, hearing from police, they say this is the easiest and safest way to disperse crowds. And they've been shown and tested based on research. But I think a lot of that work in order to prevent escalated scenarios like the ones we keep seeing play out is to really listen to the people who are demonstrating and why they are, before we head to the next event that does do a lot of damage, not only to government buildings, but, just even to, the small mom and pop shops, boutique shops, businesses, places where you go and eat in these neighborhoods. And I know, like, personally, like, even if you aren't someone who's, like, let's say owning property in these neighborhoods, it's still really difficult, I think, for people to feel like, oh, this is like where I live and all of this is happening, no matter which side you're on. Just to be exposed to that regularly, I think, is really difficult.
Well, one of the things that we were watching for in these protests last weekend, we wanted to see whether federal agents were going to show up here in Seattle as well at the protests. We had learned that they landed at Boeing Field over the weekend, which apparently surprised every elected official in Western Washington because they'd all been told that the feds were not coming.
When they arrived, I got a message from people at Boeing Field saying this federal plane had landed and some number of unidentified federal agents had gotten in vehicles for points unknown.
Up until the plane landed here, nobody really knew what was happening, whether they were showing up or not. And in fact, even Governor Inslee thought that they were not coming. That was the messaging that they'd gotten from the federal government. Right.
He had been told that by multiple people, as had the mayor. And then they showed up anyway, which shows you the utter dysfunction of this administration.
So that was King County Executive Dow Constantine. I talked with him on Tuesday about this. Apparently, the feds have left both Seattle and Portland at this point. Karen, as a journalist, what do you make of the fact that nobody knew what was happening, even as the feds were landing? Nobody, like, how do we figure out what's happening so we can report this out if nobody's got clarity on what's going on?
Oh, I mean, when this is like classic breaking news things. I was not involved with this particular moment, but that's what happens. You get signals and sources from different places and you try to piece it together. And the fact that there is a disconnect between the federal and state and local governments is, I mean, this happens all the time. I think in some sense, I mean, particularly, and this is a moment where local officials have not requested this, obviously, you know, the president seemed to be interested in making kind of a point out of Portland and Seattle and kept name dropping Seattle, even though there hadn't been the focus on federal buildings in Seattle that there was in Portland. And so there are like all these different political games going on too. And, you know, the governor had been more public in attacking the president over time, particularly about COVID related things. So, you know, Chaz, like, how many times did he tweet about it? You know, so I think it's, there's politicization through a lot of this, and that's the reality. And as a journalist also, just because you hear it from one source doesn't mean it's accurate. Your job is to talk to a lot of different sources and figure out what is actually happening.
Right. And Chase, you've pointed out that confusion about the Fed's arrival is a really good example of why skepticism is always necessary for a journalist.
Yeah, I mean, it was interesting that Saturday protest, because you were riding off of that Friday news and you saw that crowd. It was, you know, there were a lot of different groups and interests represented in that crowd, like all of the protests that have happened in Seattle. And you had a lot of, you know, moms who were suddenly appearing because they wanted to be a part of the wall of moms. And then you also saw the sort of the more regular protest that was still just focused on SPD and, you know, no new youth jail. And so it was that confusion really created a unique crowd that I think led to the event that we saw.
One of the things that I also feel like I keep seeing is, and this is something that a lot of us are having to do in the local media sometimes, is we're prefacing information that we have about protests with police say, right? Sometimes the police are the only source of information that we have. So we preface what we're reporting with Seattle Police Report or police say, given though that we have seen examples throughout the course of these protests where the police are not giving us the full narrative. In some cases, they're telling us false information. Is just prefacing information with police say enough? Like, those words are doing a lot of work for us. Jennifer, what do you think?
Yeah, I agree with both Chase and Karen when it comes to just making sure that you're being really diligent, that you're talking to a wide variety of sources and people, not always taking, you know, authorities at their word, but really questioning and, like Chase said, remaining skeptical. I think that's really important. And I think, you know, one of the key roots of journalism is staying curious. And I think it's also staying curious of information that is handed down from no matter who it is. And of course, even with a police agency, as a journalist, I want to be able to trust that the information that is being disseminated through that entity is going to be accurate. But, you know, just after working in this field, you know, there have been moments where sometimes, you know, we get ahead of the curve even before law enforcement, and then that information comes out confirmed a couple days later. But I think that's also a conversation of, you know, just ethics in journalism as well.
Well, Jennifer, your newsroom, Q13, is one of the newsrooms here in Seattle, in addition to KUOW 7, KUOW, and King 5, that is involved with a subpoena from the Seattle police. The Seattle police are trying to get raw footage material from your newsroom and the others to try and identify, they say, someone who set a fire in late May. I won't ask you details about what's happening right now. We know that a King County Superior Judge sided with the police in this case, but why should people care about the outcome of this case?
Mm-hmm. I'm just going to put it out there that you guys know as much as I know. Mm-hmm. And just for everyone's like understanding, you know, the police are after video footage, and it's combined with all of the different news outlets, hours and hours on end of video. Of course, police work does take a lot of time, and even just using the example of body camera footage, that's a lot of work to sift through. So, I mean, just even from the standpoint of the actual video that they're trying to collect, I mean, will it actually be helpful to their investigation? I think a lot of journalists have said, you know, this will set a dangerous precedence when it comes to our coverage moving forward, because, you know, really, like, who are we serving? What is our duty to the public?
Right. Karen, because we're on Zoom, I could see you take a huge sigh when I asked that previous question. So what are your thoughts on those?
I mean, I think as a journalist, you want to be able to cover public events and public protests on a variety of topics. And if there's a chance that your reporting, your unpublished reporting through photos, notes, video could potentially be released publicly, and protesters in general know that, why would they allow you in their midst? Why would they talk to you? Why would they not hurt you in some cases? And so I think the argument that news organizations are making on this is that it's a physical risk to the to the core work that journalists do, kind of First Amendment type of freedom of press work that journalists do. And so I believe the judge had narrowed the request and said, you know, these are the kind of the few cases where under Washington state law that this is allowed. It had, you know, it's very focused. They had exhausted other resources. It was for a very serious crime, et cetera, et cetera. But I think the fear of the news organizations that I have read, they have said in their response to the suit is that it creates an overall problem for journalists that could be physically harmful in covering future protests, and just generally harmful to the ability to, because I think we've all covered, you go out there and you're like in the crowd and you're talking to people and you're like, hi, want to talk to me, please? Or you're taking pictures or you're doing whatever. And the fact that you could become, you're very exposed, and to do your job, you want people to be able to talk to you.
Chase, you said that there's really no way for journalists to come out of this looking unbiased. What did you mean by that?
Yeah, I mean, it's a tough situation because if the news organizations fight the subpoena, then it sort of seems as if they are working with protesters in some cases. You know, the Seattle Times talked about how some of their readers were saying, you know, why are you defending criminals, assuming that the protesters were being criminals. And then if they don't fight the subpoena, it obviously can seem like they're working with the police, and it creates a tough situation in that regard. So I think the best way forward is for news organizations to be really transparent about this process and where they are at in the process. And I think the Seattle Times has done a great job with that. Other news organizations have been really upfront with this process. And I think that if we can continue doing that with the public, then it can maybe help us with this situation. But obviously it's tough in either direction.
one of the things we've seen both, we've seen this from the police on occasion. We've also, seen and heard this from activists, is that there are times when they're very clear that they do not trust local media because of, decisions that we have all made in the past about how we cover different issues. We're talking about a specific situation that's happening right now, but, given that we all sort of are sitting on the legacies of our institutions, I guess, and the choices that people have made, how do we move forward in good faith, covering stories like these ongoing protests? Karen, what do you think?
I mean, I find when people talk to you one-on-one as a journalist, it's really different than the opinion of you more broadly, or of a news organization or something. And that's always the challenge, is to kind of get their foot in the door to the conversation. And that's part of why, like, physically you want to be able to be there and to talk to people. Because I think people generally, I've had plenty of people be like, oh, the New York Times, fake news or whatever. And then you talk to them and they're like, oh, you're a human, I'm a human, let's talk. And let me, call and fact check, and they like appreciate that, things like that. So it's a hard, long process, and some of it is survivable and some of it is not. There's also just a bigger social era we're playing into of social divisions and social media and all that stuff. And some of it is just not in our control. And you can report on the effects of that. And in some sense, that's like a journalist's power, is to report on what is happening and to help explain and people understand it. But it's complex.
It's complex feels like as good a place as any to leave this conversation. I think we could spend the rest of the hour just talking about this, but instead we'll take a short break and then we'll be back very shortly with Karen Weise, Chase Burns, and Jennifer Lee. I'm Jeannie Yandel. This is the Week in Review. Yes, thank you.
Support for KUOW comes from the Washington Education Association, which believes that racial equity and social justice for all students and educators is a priority. Learn more at washingtonea.org.
This is 94.9 KUOW, Seattle's NPR news station. Sound stories, sound voices. 73 degrees in Seattle. Going to be sunny this afternoon with a high of 80. Cloudy overnight and partly sunny tomorrow. It's 12:49. We return to KUOW's Week in Review.
This is the Week in Review from KUOW. I'm Jeannie Yandel, sitting in for Bill Radke. And with me, I have the digital editor for The Stranger, Chase Burns, Q13 reporter, Jennifer Lee, and technology correspondent for The New York Times, Karen Weise. Karen, as you mentioned before, it has been a busy week for Amazon. Yesterday, the company announced extremely high earnings for the second quarter of the year, beating the estimated earnings by 491.9%. That's a very high percentage. And the same day that was happening, Amazon founder and CEO Jeff Bezos was talking to Congress, although based on the conversation, he might have wished he was somewhere else.
In July 2019, your employee, Nate Sutton, told me under oath in this committee that Amazon does not, quote, use any specific seller data when creating its own private brand product. So let me ask you, Mr. Bezos, does Amazon ever access and use third-party seller data when making business decisions? And just a yes or no will suffice, sir.
I thank you for the question. I know it's an important topic, and I also want to thank you for representing us. I can't answer that question yes or no. What I can tell you is we have a policy against using seller-specific data to aid our private label business, but I can't guarantee you that that policy has never been violated.
Okay, so that was Washington State Representative Pramila Jayapal talking to Jeff Bezos. Karen, what's going on in this clip?
So this was at the big antitrust hearings on Wednesday. It's actually the day before earnings, but that's fine. And this was the four CEOs of Apple, Google, Facebook, and Amazon were up talking, facing the House Antitrust Committee. And it was the first time Jeff Bezos had ever testified before Congress, unlike the other CEOs. And this was the opening question that he faced. And it gets to this question of broadly of Amazon's relationship to the sellers who make up the majority of whose products make up the majority of sales on the website. So you might, when you go to Amazon.com, more than half of the things that people end up buying are actually not sold by Amazon. Amazon is just a marketplace like eBay or whatever that kind of facilitates the sale. But Amazon also does sell products directly, and in some cases develops its own products directly. And so this was responding to questions that whether or not Amazon misused the data from these third-party sellers to create its own product. And that frame of, I can't tell you this, but what I can tell you this, was a kind of a common response Jeff Bezos had in the hearing, because a lot of things came down to individual situations, and he would say, you know, that's not, it's not supposed to happen that way. I don't believe that's emblematic of our business. Amazon takes a lot of pride in the number of, you know, there's of third-party sellers on the marketplace. They see these as small businesses that they help facilitate in the digital economy. But there's also clearly, and I've reported extensively on this as well, a lot of distrust and a lot of frustration with Amazon as well. Of yes, people's sales may be growing, their profits have been shrinking over time and things like that. So this was kind of like this key issue of trying to hold him accountable for something, and him saying, in theory, yes, in theory, no, but in practice, I can't say. So anyways, it was kind of one of the more tense moments in the meeting. People kind of anticipated his first exchange.
Yeah. I feel like I have seen tech CEOs brought to Capitol Hill before and be grilled in front of a congressional committee, but I don't actually know if anything changes as a result of those discussions, of those hearings. What is the purpose of these hearings? And I mean, will we see any changes from them?
So to some degree, the purpose of this particular hearing, the way it was set up, was just to have a public way of saying, this is a concern, or that's why the committee did it. If they really wanted to use this format to dive in and get new answers, they wouldn't have chosen this format. They wouldn't have had all 4 CEOs on the same day with very different companies. I mean, Amazon's business is very different than Apple's business, for example. And they would have had more time to kind of go into each one individually. But at the same time, there is power of being able to pull them all together and say, broadly, these are 4 of the largest companies in the world. They're all in this industry. There are some commonalities in terms of them kind of having a player-coach role to some extent. You know, Apple does have its own apps in the App Store, and it also controls the App Store with third-party developers. So, but I think the overall thing was just to get attention and to say, like, this is a thing we're working on and looking at, and then how that translates into new law or enforcement is a little bit of a different question.
Okay, so Congress is showing their work, I guess, a little bit. That's something. Yeah. So I wanted to mention something that we just heard in this last break, which was the high temperature today, which is going to be 80 degrees. So the past couple of weeks have been warm for Seattle. They've been hot. They've been sunny. In the before times, obviously, you know, things would have looked a little different. We might have been going to swimming pools, going to lakes, rivers a little bit more. Things are obviously different now. But one thing that does feel familiar about this is this argument that I feel like I've been hearing. I have lived in Seattle for going on 20 years now. And it's this argument that Seattle is not a place that needs air conditioning. So full disclosure, I have air conditioning. I'm also sitting in my basement, which is like 10 degrees cooler than the rest of my house. But also we're spending a lot more time indoors now, pandemic. Wildfires have already started, climate change. These are both reasons you might want to close your windows and have air conditioning. Chase Burns, you were born in Florida, the swampy confines of Florida. What is your thinking on how Seattle sort of addresses heat?
Look, I can't be a hypocrite about air conditioning because Florida exists because of the invention of air conditioning, essentially. But I do think it's funny that I think people are going to react like they're, oh, it's so hot, when they sort of reach the top point of the however hot it gets in the region. So in Seattle, it's like between like 50 and 80. And whenever it gets to 80, people are so hot. And whenever it gets to 50, people are like, oh, it's so cold. And I think a lot of it is just like we sort of have to do that as a culture so that we can mark the changing of seasons. And so I get it. I lived in Minnesota where it got like -20 and you weren't going to be like, it's cold until it's that low. That being said, I'm not going to shame anyone for having air conditioning. I don't have air conditioning just because my apartment didn't come with it. And I sort of like hate window units. I'm always afraid that they're going to like fall out, which I know is a little irrational, but I'm just like, I can't trust myself with this big machine. But Yeah, it's sometimes sweating I think is good for you. It's a little bit of a detox. So just let it happen for a few days.
Monday was like a little bit too much though. Really, you work from home, right? People used to go into air-conditioned offices, or people who worked in offices or in a restaurant might have AC or something, a hospital, but now you're doing telemedicine, whatever it may be.
Yes.
But that said, I feel like, every summer we have we kind of Google how much does it cost to get AC, and then we don't do it. So it's the handful of days and you move on. And at least it drops overnight mostly.
So Karen, are you saying that you are okay with this idea that Seattle is a place that doesn't need air conditioning? Like we can be a place that considers
I
it?
can't say I will never make that investment, but I feel like it's not so far, but I don't know if that will change. Right, okay. Climate change and there was very hard. Was it 2 summers ago when there were the really bad fires during the heat wave, and you couldn't open your windows to cool off, and that was legitimate. I had a little baby at the time, and it was really hard to keep his body. We put him in cold water baths.
Yes, I remember that very clearly. Remember walking outside and there was ash all over everything. Yes. That was something. Jennifer, what do you think? Can we finally let go of this notion that Seattle is a place that doesn't need air conditioning?
I'm listening and learning. I'm a year into Seattle. I'm from the Northeast. My parents have been telling me in New Jersey it's getting mid 90s. So I do have an air conditioning unit, but I swear I think I've only used it 2 hours at a time because it's really cold at night. So, I'll take the tips. What is the most efficient way to air condition in Seattle?
I'm a crazy lady. I open everything up in the morning when it's cool. And then around 9 a.m., I shut every window and close every door. And I just go totally nuts. It buys you a couple hours at least.
Yeah.
That I feel like in the past, I know that certainly KUOW has done stories on which way you turn your fan or how to make a swamp cooler or all of these things. And perhaps we can just load all of those links up as our houses down when we need to. And that is the end of the Week in Review for today. Thank you so much to my panel, Chase Burns, digital editor for The Stranger, Q13 reporter Jennifer Lee, and New York Times technology correspondent Karen Weise. Thanks for weighing in on the very tricky air conditioning issue as well. Our show is produced by Sarah Leibovitz. Our live stream online is brought to you by Juan Pablo Chiquiza and Tio Popescu. Zeki Hamid is your host next week. I'm Jeannie Yandel. Thanks so much for joining us. Have a great weekend.